Good evening. Welcome to Bring the World Home, a production of the Returned Peace Corps Volunteers of Hawaii. In our program, we visit with volunteers that have returned from service overseas in one of the 132 different countries around the world that the Peace Corps serves. My name is Chip Telton. I was a volunteer in Malaysia in 1968. Today we have Barbara George, who was a volunteer in Honduras in Central America from 1998 to 2001. Welcome. I'm glad you could join us today.
Thank you. Thanks. It's a pleasure.
We're here in Hawaii, out in the middle of the Pacific, and you served in Honduras in Central America, right
which
there.
is right here, sort of right in the midst of the connection between Mexico and Colombia. I went from Boston. I was living in Boston at the time, so very different trajectory from Hawaii, but
Yes.
there it is.
Honduras is a kind of an interesting country. I know that in that era there was a large hurricane that hit there. There's bordered by Guatemala and Salvador and
El
Nicaragua.
Salvador
Is
and
that correct?
Nicaragua, that's right.
And has been all throughout the 70s and 80s. Of course, that area was very controversial in American history because of the revolutionary nature of some of the governments and different aspects of the ongoing drug trade, etc., that a lot of people are familiar with. When you went to Honduras, you went as what?
You're asking what I
In
worked?
what capacity? What did you do there as a Peace Corps volunteer?
I went as an agriculture volunteer. There were 5 sectors or 5 work areas at the time. And I went to do agriculture. It was, the program was called Hillside Farming.
Oh.
And that was referring to the fact that it's extremely mountainous country, and at least where I was in the western part of the country, very mountainous, very poor soil for the most part. So the farmers were mainly subsistence farmers, and were working with land that really was like this in terms of trying to farm. Yes.
Was it fertile though, or?
Not in the area that I was in. Now up in the north, where it's flatter, and that's where they grow the pineapples, the bananas, etc. That land is quite fertile. But
well, you said that you came from Boston to Honduras, to the small town, your town, and we were talking before the show began about something that was near and dear to your heart that you learned as a Peace Corps volunteer, and which was about humility. Could you share that with our viewers again? Because now that I hear that you came from Boston, you went into agriculture. We don't think of Boston as an agricultural area, so.
No, and in fact, I was a fairly atypical volunteer in another sense as well. I went in my mid to late 30s, which is, the typical volunteer is quite a bit younger. So I kind of went mid-career, and I also intentionally wanted to do something that was completely different from what my career had been up to that time.
Which was what? What was your career at that point?
I was and am, again, I suppose you could say, a psychologist.
Oh, wonderful.
So I was working in Boston for many years as a psychologist. I had started to cultivate an interest in alternative medicine, medicinal plants, gardening, that sort of thing, concurrently, and that sort of got me the into the agriculture part of Peace Corps. So yes, it was quite a different world going from Boston to this little 15-house town at the end of a very bumpy dirt road, 3-hour bus ride from the nearest town with electricity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were working as a professional in the field of psychology in Boston,
Right.
out of school. As you point out, a lot of many volunteers are younger, maybe just out of college.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's volunteers from all realms and segments, but
Right.
and we have here on the back of the wall, what do we call this?
We call this,
embroidery?
actually in Spanish would be called a croquis,
A croquis?
which is
Depicts your town of
a
Dolores?
representation of the town. Now, my embroidery skills are not nearly up to par with the embroidery skills of the local folks. They're actually quite skilled at it, but this was my attempt to create a representation of my town.
Well, I think it depicts very nicely the aspects of the town. It's obviously a small town. You said about how many families or dwellings were
About
comprised?
15 houses, you know, between 5, 10, 12 people in a 1 to 2 room small home.
And so your service there, you had told me earlier, was the 5th in a succession of other volunteers,
Right.
all working, all previously in agriculture and the same kind of
Right.
hillside.
Right, with the same goals, really trying to help folks deal with erosion control issues, diversifying their crops, improving nutrition incidentally to that, trying to use green manures and not chemical kinds of fertilizers, trying to stay away from the use of insecticides and pesticides.
So in your, if you were the 5th in succession, a typical tour of duty is about 2 years.
Right.
So Peace Corps had been in this village about 10 years or so.
It's 8 years, right.
Okay.
Right.
And then what did you, now I'm going to ask you as a psychologist, what did you find there? You arrived and a lot of viewers are interested in, is Peace Corps really just a vacation for volunteers and they don't really accomplish much? You know, is it a waste of our taxpayers' money? Is it a good foreign policy program? So what was your impression when you got there? You're the 5th volunteer to be in the village.
Right. I was the 5th volunteer, so the town was relatively familiar with Americans.
Sure.
However, I was the first female volunteer,
Okay.
and a female working in agriculture in that culture is quite an anomaly.
Mm-hmm.
So I had quite a challenge just basically developing credibility with the predominantly male farmers.
Yes. Do the women do any agriculture work?
Yes, the
Culturally?
women work very, very hard. They're up, 3, 4 in the morning. They're doing it all until well after sunset.
More than the men, most likely.
For the most part, they're always busy. They just,
Yeah.
they never sit down and they never take a break. They tend to not be the ones who go out into the fields actually and do the official formal crop work. They have gardens around the home. They certainly are involved in all of the processing of the crops. So for beans, you're shelling the beans, you're cleaning the beans, you're, the whole thing from plot to plate. The women are involved in every step of that process.
Well, with that alliteration is, so the question for you is, had Peace Corps been successful there? Why were they back for a 5th tour of duty? Why hadn't these people become self-sufficient in that aspect?
That's
just your opinion.
complicated, right? Well, it was set up as a 10-year plan initially by Peace Corps,
All right.
so that there would be a succession and
Continuity to the program.
right.
Good.
And I did close it out. There was a question halfway through my service. Have we done as much as we can do here, and should we close it out, or do we need to continue? And I did feel like we had reached as many people as were going to be reachable with that kind of approach. And as in parallels in my psychology work, there's a certain proportion of people who are going to be kind of receptive and available and going to pick up and go with the things that you have to offer. And so there was a good core of folks, farmer leaders we call them, who were now doing model plots, model farms, teaching, passing on the knowledge by the time that I left.
And well, it sounds like the people of the area, the community, were receptive to Peace Corps' assistance and guidance. And again, in your opinion, were they thankful for Peace Corps' presence there over the years?
I think very much so. I think sort of on a when I was there, we called these secondary projects. But to me, that was really the most meaningful, in the heart of things, is the kind of behind the scenes, not official ways in which Peace Corps, via me as a person, I suppose, had an impact or an influence.
Well, you brought a picture you showed me earlier, which was very interesting, of the taken in your home, you had told me.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about that.
Right. This was a town with no electricity, and also a town with, you know, the base rate is really, most people don't even complete 6th grade. That's sort of the official standard. But many people are dropping out for 2nd grade, that kind of thing. So there's not for a lot of reasons, the formal educational system is really quite limited.
Yeah.
And
one question.
Yeah.
This is true just in your village, or to your knowledge, kind of countrywide?
The country. Very high illiteracy rate.
Honduras has
absolutely
one of the highest in Central America, I believe I've heard.
In the Western Hemisphere,
okay.
I believe. And also, it's one of the poorest, if not maybe 2nd poorest to Haiti in the Western Hemisphere.
While we're on the subject, when you were there in 98 to 2000, about how many other volunteers were serving in the country, if you know?
We were almost 200. So as far as I know, we were the biggest Peace Corps country in the world at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, and had been for some time. So I, being a voracious reader, took a lot of books, had a lot of books, had a lot of children's books, picture books, etc. And just informally, my house sort of became the place where the kids would come after school to also to really to look through my photo albums. I had brought photos of things at home and started taking a lot of photos once I was there. And that was the activity, coming over to read.
Better than television, yeah.
And, well, no electricity, so no television. That was the television, 24/7 live TV. At La Gringa's house. Yeah.
Great. Well, did they have knowledge of Boston, Massachusetts?
Oh, no. No. No, and, you know, I had maps and tried to talk about snow and cold, and you can only go so far in explaining that when they're basically living in a tropical culture. But I want to talk about this picture because so really there's not a culture of formal education as we know it, book learning, reading for knowledge, reading for information, that kind of thing.
Or even reading for pleasure, right?
Right. A very few books or reading materials even available. And again, a very high illiteracy rate. So my house kind of became the place for the kids to come after school, and it was really wonderful to see some of the kids would start reading, and then the younger kids would come because they wanted to join in. What's going on here? So the older kids would start reading to the younger kids, and eventually it got so those kids would read to the really young kids or point out pictures. And then one night, these kids, knock on my door, and these kids had dragged their mother over to the house to read to them. And so this picture is a picture of the mother sitting in the hammock out on the back porch. All the kids are gathered around. Her daughter is holding the flashlight for her to be able to read. And you just have to remember that there's no electricity. Yeah. So the one little light was the flashlight.
Dark night. Yeah.
Right. But they really got excited about reading. So that's a very small thing, but in some ways I feel like that might have been the most long-lasting impact that I had in terms of something that I might see if I were to go back in 5 or 10 years.
Well, the joy of reading, I'm sure, has carried on. That's a great secondary project, as you described, to instill. Mm-hmm. And maybe, as the first female volunteer, maybe that's the foundation for that to occur. I mean, the males obviously the males before you may not have been able to make that connection that you had.
Well, I think one of the beauties of Peace Corps is that there is room, once you get out to your site, after you go through all the training and et cetera, you get out to your site and basically it's up to you to come up with what you're going to do, how you're going to spend your time, what you're going to emphasize. Mm-hmm. And so that was an interest that I sort of had or just developed serendipitously, and that's the wonderful thing about Peace Corps, I think.
Another question that brings to my mind the question of how did you become interested in the Peace Corps? We're part of our mission with this program and with the Return Peace Corps Volunteers of Hawaii is to share the knowledge that we've gained overseas, but first step is how do we get involved with the Peace Corps? How do we transcend the idea of being an American, going to McDonald's and the mall and whatever it might be? That's kind of a very simplistic evaluation of Americans, but what's your story, please?
Well, like I said, I came at it from a little bit different angle than maybe your typical volunteer in terms of, I had a career for many years, and like I said, I was kind of developing an interest in simplifying my life. I saw that through my work as a psychologist, many sources of anxiety, depression, stress, et cetera, seem to be related to the go-go pace, the intensity, the high stress of certainly of urban Eastern Coast life.
Yes.
So my life was just motoring along just fine, and I just decided I needed to shake it up a little bit, I guess.
How did you know? Did you know about the Peace Corps already, or?
Oh, sure,
okay.
Sure.
And you thought that was one way to solve this, and you investigated it and said, yeah, this is...
I looked into a number of different ways. I thought, well, if I'm going to make a change, I want to do a total. I'm not going to do just a little tweak here and there. And I investigated a number of things. And Peace Corps just, it's a wonderful package.
And how did you find the application process for somebody in your circumstance? Was it
very
a breeze? Were you in Honduras before you realized you had
No,
gotten this
well,
far?
I had to hold it off. Actually, I was offered 2 different go dates, and I held it off because in my work I had to I had a lot of lead time.
Sure.
I had to give people plenty of notice, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So the application process was pretty extensive and detailed, but it was straightforward. And I found, you can't say exactly where you want to go, but I said I would like to speak Spanish because I had had some prior experience with Spanish. I want to be in a warm place.
Yes.
Got to get away from these Boston winters. And I wanted a rural as opposed to an urban kind of a site. So I was able to sort of specify on that level what kind of experience I wanted, and then I was offered Honduras.
Oh, it sounds like that would fit that description nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Now that you've returned, you're back working as a psychologist.
I am.
How do you integrate what you and carry on what you've learned in Honduras? How did you bring Honduras home to your home, to your activities?
Well, that's I feel like that's a bit of a source of not quite frustration, but it's difficult to see how to carry that in to what I'm doing. I'm certainly much more culturally competent, culturally aware, culturally sensitive. One direct thing is I'm fluent in Spanish now, so I can work with people in Spanish, which helps. I really would like to find a way to do more integrating, use my knowledge of psychology and integrate that more with international development.
Oh.
But that remains to be figured out exactly how to do that.
Well, I'm
Right.
sure that can come to you. The idea of service is certainly something that people around us, I think, maybe need to know more about, and there's certainly things that people that are maybe can't go into the Peace Corps could learn from you and learn from your experiences to apply in their own community here in Hawaii. You said you've just recently arrived in Hawaii, or been here about a year or so. Where did you return to from Honduras, and how did you end up here in Hawaii?
I wanted to return to Boston, but I really couldn't afford to go back there. That readjustment allowance doesn't go very far.
Not in the modern times.
No. It's a lot better than it used to be, though. So I, for the time being, went back to Ohio, which is where I grew up and where all of my family still is. Another little twist here is that I met and fell in love with a Honduran man and brought him back with me. And we have a 2.5-year-old son.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. And so that is an ongoing experiment in cross-cultural relations.
That's literally bringing the world.
Yes, right.
Bringing your world home.
Right, right.
And you brought something that I'd like to have our viewers see before we wrap it up here in just a minute or so. Could you show this to us and tell us a little bit about it?
This is just an example of some of the artisanry or the artifacts that folks do. Honduras, I think, is known for its wood carvings, and this is just a small example of that. All done by hand, obviously.
Is this done by somebody in your village, or?
Now, where I was, this was not done. This is done more in the southern part of the country. In my area, weaving with grasses and some very basic pottery were the main handicrafts,
Okay.
right. I do want to show this, though. This actually is kind of a typical example of a bag that's very functional. It's a little bit dirty right at the moment.
Well
but
used.
Very well
And
used.
appreciated, I'm
yes. Now, these were actually made by men in the local prison, and this is how they created a little bit of income for themselves. So you would go to the bus stop in the main town, and across from the bus stop was the prison and a little gateway there, and they would hold out their wares and sell their things. So I have several of those. Another interesting Hawaii connection, I realized not long ago that what I knew, what I learned of as called malanga in Honduras, is actually
Taro chips.
taro chips.
So malanga would be taro in Hawaii.
Yes, they're quite tasty.
Oh, wonderful.
So
Well, we have one more picture here that is really, I find very interesting. It's could you tell me a little bit about it? It's obviously a religious
right.
ceremony.
Honduras obviously is predominantly a Catholic country, and this shows they have patron saint days. Every town has its own patron saint.
Oh, well, that's really a fantastic experience you had. And I appreciate your coming by and visiting with us today. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as our viewers will, and I want to welcome you back if you ever have the opportunity to spend some more time with us.
Thank you.
That consumes our time for today. Bring the world home. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Ya no voy a detenerte. Me cansé de quererte de esa forma como quieres tú. Que te vas.